In the summer of 1941, the newly introduced DeHavilland Mosquito was making its first reconnaissance sorties, demonstrating a grave problem for the Luftwaffe. Operating at high speeds and altitude, the aircraft was almost untouchable after it had reached its destination and entered a shallow, fast descent for home. The only two fighters of consequence employed by the Luftwaffe, the Bf-109 and FW-190, were effective low to medium altitude fighters, though their performance was poor at the altitudes the Mosquito flew at. With the US entry in the war, the problem became graver, as they possessed specialized high-altitude fighter and bomber designs which might threaten the Luftwaffe's hold over much of Europe. Even more concerning was the fear that the RAF would be operating the Vickers Wellington V bomber, which was reportedly capable of operating at an almost untouchable altitude of 12 kilometers. They never entered service, but the growing high-altitude disparity would see the creation of the Höhenjäger, or high-altitude fighter program. With these anxieties building, the RLM convened a conference on the development of high-altitude fighters on May 20, 1942, at Messerschmitt's plant in Augsburg. From this conference, both Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf would seek to build a high-altitude fighter that would be able to hold its own against the Allies. Focke-Wulf was quick to pursue turbocharging to get their fighter to reach the adequate level of performance for the Höhenjäger project. Almost immediately, they ran into the issue that it was almost impossible to fit a suitable turbocharger into an FW-190A. Though an externally mounted and almost completely unwieldy unit was suggested, they would attempt to improve the Anton by lengthening its wings and installing a pressurized canopy, but this FW-190B would still fail to be much of a threat at high altitudes. In parallel with the B project, the decision was made to re-engine the aircraft with the Junkers UMO 213 and Daimler-Benz's DB603. Both promised better high-altitude performance over the BMW 801, along with a considerable overall increase in engine output. The DB603 project would proceed with the designation FW-190C and the UMO 213 one as the FW-190D. Neither project would produce the aircraft the Luftwaffe sought. The FW-190D would transition into a medium-altitude fighter to replace the Anton series Focke-Wulf, with only a handful being actual high-altitude models. The FW-190C project would fail after it was unable to secure enough DB603s and would be finally cancelled after further efforts to install a turbocharger were met with disappointing results. Kurt Tank would hope to find a new high-altitude fighter in his new fighter, the TA-153, a clean-sheet successor to the Focke-Wulf 190. Given the state of the German economy, a clean-sheet design was off the table, so Tank designed the TA-152, a compromise with the existing FW-190D. In order to avoid impacting the production of the FW-190D, the high-altitude model was the first to be developed, with the hopes that the fighter and fighter-bomber models would later phase out the FW-190D. The high-altitude TA-152 model featured a new UMO 213E engine with a 3-stage after-cooled supercharger, a hydraulic landing gear system, an improved vertical stabilizer from the FW-190C, larger wings, and a half-meter fuselage extension in the rear fuselage, with the ensuing redistribution of weight helping to correct for an issue with the aircraft's center of gravity. It was also to carry both a high-altitude GM1 boost system and a MW50 low-altitude boost system. After a rushed developmental period, the first prototype flew on July 13, 1944, and was lost after it crashed during its 36-minute test flight at Vechta. The second prototype flew on August 6th, and, like the first, was lost, though this time resulting in the death of a test pilot. More success was had with the third prototype, which flew on September 29, 1944, and the fourth, which flew shortly after. Serious trouble with the program was encountered as late as November, when a prototype crash-landed after its engine seized due to fuel starvation, It was found a hydraulic valve had been installed in the fuel line, an accident most likely a result of the aircraft's rush development. The losses and damages experienced at this point in testing were threatening to seriously interrupt the pace of the project, but in the end, they rushed through development. Its troubles aside, the plane was achieving good high-altitude performance, both in terms of speed and ceiling. Test pilot Friedrich Schneer would fly one prototype to a height of 13.6 kilometers on January 20th, 1945. The program's most serious problem was that it never found a configuration that allowed it to carry both its boost systems. With no provisions for carrying GM1 at all by the time it entered pre-production in November 1944, the TA-152H0 entered service without several of the key features that the plane was set to carry, lacking the outer wing fuel tanks and both engine boost systems. As such, it was considerably lighter and had better handling than the production model, but it was considerably slower. The H1 production model would have wing tanks and provisions to install the boost systems, though unresolved weight distribution issues prevented them from all being used together. It was in this rough state that it was delivered to the Luftwaffe for testing in December. Given their very late introduction during the war, the TA-152H's combat record is extremely limited. The aircraft was only supplied to JG-301, a dual night and day fighter squadron which transitioned to them from FW-190A8s on January 27th. The squadron had a good pool of experienced pilots, already familiar with Focke-Wulf aircraft, though their mechanics would have a far more difficult task, as the TA-152H had been pushed into service without maintenance manuals. At the airfield of Altenau, they received 11 of the new aircraft. They would attempt to engage Allied bombers on March 2nd, but the 12 TA-152Hs would fail to reach them, as they were attacked by the Bf-109s of another squadron, which mistook their unfamiliar planes for the enemy. No aircraft were lost in the engagement. A second high-altitude interception against the DeHavilland Mosquito was also attempted, though engine trouble forced the pilot to return to base before contact was made. This would be the last attempt to use the fighter at high altitude. In March, the understrength unit was supplied with several FW-190A9s. Outnumbered and with little security, the TA-152Hs often flew top cover for the rest of the unit during what few operations were undertaken. On April 10th, Erfurt was contested, and during the fighting, the 8 serviceable TA-152s engaged a flight of 15 P-47s near Brunswick. Gruppe 3's last operation were conducted from Neustadt-Glewe, and on April 15th, the unit suffered its first combat loss. 3 TA-152s sortied to intercept a pair of RAF Hawker Tempests engaging in a low-level sweep. According to Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke, the TA-152H in the number 2 position, flown by Sepp Sattler, suddenly lost control and crashed before contact was made, seemingly suffering a fatal malfunction. The remaining TA-152s engaged the Tempests of 486 Squadron. In the ensuing battle, Reschke entered an intense, low-level dogfight with one of the Tempests. Near the start of the engagement, he fired on and struck the tail of a Hawker Tempest flown by Lieutenant Mitchell, though his gun's electrical circuit seemingly failed shortly after. However, in the aggressive maneuvers that followed, Mitchell lost control of his damaged aircraft and crashed. Following his loss, both forces withdrew. The lead TA-152H, flown by Oberstleutnant Fritz Aufhammer, suffered a supercharger failure, which nearly destroyed his aircraft and forced him to return to base. Sattler and Mitchell were subsequently buried at a cemetery in Neustadt-Glewe. This engagement is noteworthy, as it showed both that had a good pilot in a 152 could hold their own, but also the extremely rough state of the planes themselves. The last actions of the squadron were in the last stages of the battle for Berlin, and on April 24th, the TA-152s and FW-190s of the 2nd and 3rd Gruppe attacked Soviet positions and engaged Jak-Diewice. The final mission was flown over Berlin in poor conditions, and during an engagement with a flight of 4 Jak-Diewices, Hauptmann Hermann Stahl was killed, with the 4 Jak-Diewices being claimed by the unit. After the surrender, the the unit rebased to Schleswig-Holstein, where they were disbanded. In all, the TA-152H was never actually used for any high-altitude combat operations, and its service was restricted to a single understrength unit. With at most 10 victories and 4 operational losses, it is difficult to give any appraisal for its performance from its brief career with JG-301. Josel Keil was the only pilot to qualify as an ace on the TA-152H, and together with Willy Reschke, who had 2 credits in the TA-152H and 24 in other aircraft, held nearly all of the aircraft's combat credits between them. While the TA-152H's combat record leaves a lot of questions left unanswered, most pilots who had the chance to get behind the controls of the aircraft can at least agree that the aircraft flew very well. Among its most famous advocates was Royal Navy test pilot Eric Brown. He would praise its excellent climb performance, maneuverability at high altitude, stability, and good landing characteristics. His only complaints were that its roll rate was reduced over the older FW-190A, that its stick forces were notably heavier, its cockpit was cramped, and that its wheel brakes were awful and prone to fade after a few moments of use. He otherwise considered it an excellent aircraft. He flew the H-0, the slower but more maneuverable and stable of the 2 wartime models. Stick forces were notably fairly high, but they were harmonized well, and the pushrod control system ensured inputs were very responsive. However, stability on the vertical axis was poor, and there was a tendency to skid. This tendency grew worse at higher altitudes and motivated the designers to install a level flight autopilot in certain models of the aircraft. Visibility was good around the sides and rear, with the view over the nose being somewhat poor. The controls were placed conveniently, with the instrument panel layout being clean and easy to read. A high level of automation from the UMO 213's Bediengerät, or control device, relieved the pilot of much of the workload of engine management. These factors generally made the TA-152H a relatively straightforward aircraft to fly. However, it was not without its drawbacks, most notably its cramped cockpit with little headroom. Much more dangerously, test pilots found the plane unstable at high-altitude dives. Instability was also a concern when the GM-1 system was used without a ballast kit and the removal of the MW-50 system and fuel tank restrictions. It was thus that the plane flew with combinations of the 3 systems, but never all at once. While the TA-152H has somewhat of a legendary reputation among World War II fighters, in reality, the plane was pushed into service in a rough, unfinished state and assigned to crews that faced an impossible situation. It represented a significant leap in German high-altitude fighter design, but the nitrous boosting that would have given it unparalleled performance was never worked into the design satisfactorily. It was also never able to perform its designed mission and used exclusively at lower altitudes, where the mass-produced FW-190 Dora 9 was generally superior. In all, the TA-152H promised a good deal, but industrial limitations and a lack of time would prevent it from living up to the legend that so many after the war made it out to be. This concludes our video on the tank TA-152H. What are your thoughts on this high-altitude fighter? Feel free to share your thoughts on this unique vehicle in the comments section. As always, we here at Plane Encyclopedia appreciate your love and support, so feel free to leave a like and subscribe to know exactly when new content rolls out. If you'd like to buy us some fuel to keep us going, visit us on Patreon or via PayPal. Until next time, stay tuned and keep following our updates.